I came to see my girlfriend, but her sister answered the door, and everything changed. The day had felt like any other, yet there was a quiet anticipation in my chest as I walked up the familiar steps to her apartment. My mind raced through a checklist of little things I wanted to say, little moments I hoped we'd share, but I never expected the first image to catch me so completely off guard. I pressed the doorbell and waited, hearing the faint hum of life inside. When the door opened, it wasn't her. It was her sister, and everything shifted in a single heartbeat. She stood there, poised and composed, in a way that made the room feel warmer just by her presence. In her early 40s, she carried herself with a natural elegance that seemed effortless. Her hair fell in gentle waves around her face, and there was a calmness in her posture that contrasted sharply with the nervous energy I felt. Her eyes, warm yet piercing, assessed me with a quiet curiosity, a subtle tilt of her head that suggested she was both welcoming and cautious. "Hi. I wasn't expecting anyone today," I started, my voice a little unsteady. The words felt trivial compared to the sudden surge of awareness I had, the curve of her smile, the ease with which she stood, and the faint, intriguing scent of perfume that lingered in the air. "I know," she said softly, her voice low and velvety, "your girlfriend isn't home right now. But come in if you want, it's not far." There was a slight hesitation in her words, almost as if she was trying to gauge my reaction. I nodded, fumbling slightly with the door, feeling a strange mixture of apology and intrigue. As I stepped inside, I noticed little details that I hadn't before: the gentle warmth of the apartment, the way the afternoon light fell across the polished wooden floors, and the faint aroma of fresh tea that seemed to wrap around the space. The sister's presence anchored the room, subtle yet undeniable. She moved with a grace that made every gesture, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, adjusting a cushion, feel effortless and intimate. We exchanged small talk, polite and measured, but beneath the surface, something taut and unspoken hummed between us. I couldn't quite pinpoint it, a look held a fraction too long, a smile that lingered with quiet understanding. It was confusing and yet strangely compelling. Every time our hands brushed while I handed over my coat, a small jolt ran up my arm. It was electric, but careful, respectful, a spark of something forbidden yet tender. I found myself taking in her features without realizing it, the way her eyes softened when she smiled, the subtle laugh lines that hinted at years of experience and quiet joy, and the gentle way she moved through her space, as if every step was measured but unforced. She was alluring in a way I hadn't expected, not overtly seductive, but with a quiet magnetism that pulled me in. Even as I reminded myself I was there to see my girlfriend, the sister's presence created a strange dissonance in my mind. Something about the warmth, the elegance, and the unspoken depth in her eyes made it hard to think about anything else. For the first time that day, I wondered how a simple visit could shift so unexpectedly into something that felt charged with possibility, delicate, subtle, and entirely unspoken. By the time we settled into the living room, the air between us was thick with unacknowledged curiosity. The day I had imagined, a casual visit with my girlfriend, had transformed into a quiet encounter that neither of us knew how to navigate, and yet neither of us seemed ready to leave. She led me inside, and the apartment felt warmer than I remembered, soft light spilling across the room, the faint scent of tea lingering in the air. My mind was still processing the unexpected encounter at the door. I had come to see my girlfriend, expecting familiar laughter and casual comfort, but instead, I was here with her sister, a woman who seemed to radiate quiet authority and effortless charm. "Can I offer you some tea? Or coffee?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying a subtle undertone that made me pay attention. There was a softness to it, a warmth that instantly made the awkwardness of the moment a little more bearable. I nodded, silently grateful for the small courtesy. While she moved to the kitchen, I took in the room, noticing details I hadn't before. A small stack of books on the coffee table hinted at curiosity and intelligence. A framed photograph of the sisters in happier, younger days rested on the shelf, the image both familiar and distant. Her presence in the room made the space feel alive in a way that was both comforting and disarming. When she returned with the tea, our hands brushed lightly as she handed me the cup. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet the warmth lingered in my palm longer than expected. I found myself noticing small things, the way her eyes crinkled slightly when she smiled, the soft cadence of her voice, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear with a casual grace. Every gesture seemed deliberate yet unstudied, and I felt a pull I couldn't quite name. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, yet the space between us felt charged with subtle tension. I attempted to make conversation, but the words felt clumsy, my usual ease replaced with a strange self-awareness. She laughed lightly at my awkward phrasing, and the sound was soft and melodic, like a quiet rhythm that settled my nerves. "So, how have you been?" she asked, leaning slightly forward, resting her elbows on her knees. It was a simple question, but the way she asked it made it feel deeper, more intentional. I found myself answering with more honesty than I expected, my voice softer, my thoughts more open. There was something in her presence that invited confession without pressure, a kind of safe vulnerability. Our conversation flowed slowly, interspersed with moments of silence that were comfortable rather than awkward. She shared small anecdotes about her day, subtle glimpses of her life that revealed intelligence, humor, and a quiet depth. Each story was punctuated with natural gestures, hands moving to emphasize a point, a slight lean closer when she laughed, the tilt of her head when she waited for my response. I realized, almost reluctantly, that I was drawn to her, not just her beauty or elegance, but the calm, grounded energy she exuded. There was a maturity and subtle strength in her that contrasted sharply with the youthful nervousness I sometimes carried. I caught myself stealing glances, noticing the way her eyes softened when she spoke, the way her posture relaxed slightly as she smiled. By the time the conversation drew to a close, the initial awkwardness had melted into a quiet, intimate connection. We hadn't crossed any boundaries, and yet the air between us felt charged, a delicate tension that neither of us dared acknowledge outright. I came to see my girlfriend, but in this brief encounter, I had glimpsed something unexpected, a quiet, magnetic presence that made me wonder, just for a moment, about the possibilities of this new, uncharted connection. The initial awkwardness had faded, replaced by a quiet ease I hadn't expected. Sitting across from her, I felt a strange comfort, as if the apartment itself encouraged honesty. We had moved past polite conversation, and for the first time, the discussion turned personal, tentative at first, like walking along a path both of us were unsure we should tread. "I never realized how much responsibility she has," I said, referring subtly to my girlfriend. My words were casual, but I noticed how her eyes softened at my observation. She nodded, sipping her tea slowly, the motion deliberate and calming. "She tries," she said quietly, almost to herself. Then she looked at me, her gaze steady, and added, "We all try. Sometimes life, it just wears you down in ways people don't see." There was a vulnerability in her tone, a quiet weight that hung between us. I felt my chest tighten slightly. Here was someone who carried her experiences gracefully, yet beneath the composure, there was a trace of exhaustion, a longing for understanding. I found myself opening up more than I expected. I spoke about small frustrations, my job, the pressures I didn't often voice, the moments I felt unseen despite my best efforts. She listened, truly listened, her eyes never leaving mine, her posture attentive. There was no judgment, no attempt to fix things, just a presence that made it safe to admit uncertainty. As I spoke, our hands brushed accidentally while reaching for the sugar. The contact was fleeting but electric, a warmth that seemed to radiate across the briefest of touches. I caught her glance, and she smiled softly, almost shyly, a subtle acknowledgement of the moment. It was neither romantic nor flirtatious in the conventional sense, but it held an intimacy I hadn't anticipated. The conversation grew quieter, more reflective. She spoke of her own vulnerabilities, regrets, moments of loneliness, and the unexpected twists that life had thrown at her. Her words were measured, yet honest, like she was testing the water, seeing if I could understand without judgment. I nodded, silently grateful for her trust, and found myself leaning slightly closer, drawn in by the calm intensity of her presence. There was a rhythm to our exchange, a give and take of unspoken understanding. A pause here, a thoughtful nod there, small sighs and shifts that made the space between us feel alive. I noticed the subtle details, the softness of her hair as it fell across her shoulders, the delicate lines at the corners of her eyes when she smiled, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. Each detail made her more tangible, more real, and yet somehow more distant, a paradox that heightened the tension between us. By the time the conversation wound down, I felt an unexpected closeness, a quiet intimacy that didn't need labels or declarations. There was a magnetic pull, not purely physical, but emotional, a recognition of kindred understanding. I had come to see my girlfriend, expecting comfort and familiarity, yet in this room, with her sister, I had encountered a new kind of connection, a mixture of curiosity, respect, and gentle attraction, threaded with the delicate tension of unspoken boundaries. As we settled back, letting the silence linger, I realized that this moment, simple, quiet, yet charged with emotional weight, had changed something in me. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew I would remember it, the warmth of her presence, the honesty in her gaze, and the subtle electricity in the brush of her hand. Something fragile, yet undeniable, had begun between us. After the emotional exchange earlier, a quiet energy had settled between us. The room seemed smaller, more intimate, as if the apartment itself conspired to draw us closer. I found myself acutely aware of her presence, the soft rhythm of her movements, the gentle way her fingers brushed surfaces as she passed, the warmth radiating from her when she leaned slightly in conversation. "Could you help me with this?" she asked suddenly, holding up a small picture frame that had slipped from a shelf. Her hands trembled just slightly, and without thinking, I stepped forward. My fingers met hers for a brief instant as I studied the frame, and a spark of awareness traveled through me, brief, electric, yet entirely respectful. She smiled, that same quiet, understanding smile that seemed to hold unspoken permission and gentle reassurance. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice low, intimate, carrying a softness that made me want to linger in the moment just a little longer. I realized that each small gesture, a touch, a glance, a pause, had weight, subtle but undeniable. We moved around the apartment together, fixing little things. I reached over to adjust a cushion, our shoulders brushing lightly. I felt her warmth linger for a second longer than the contact demanded, and I noticed the subtle inhale she took, a micro-reaction that made the atmosphere feel charged. It wasn't dramatic, but the attention to detail, the way she shifted slightly closer, the tilt of her head, the warmth of her hand in mine for a brief second, made everything feel significant. At one point, I laughed at a minor mishap, a spilled pen rolling across the floor, and she bent down to pick it up. Her hair fell forward, brushing against my shoulder accidentally, and I felt a shiver of awareness run through me. The brush of her hair, soft and fragrant, was not meant to seduce, yet it had the effect of drawing my focus entirely to her. I could feel the tension in my chest, the quickening of my heartbeat, and the strange, compelling pull of proximity. We sat briefly on the sofa afterward, close but not overtly intimate. Our knees brushed lightly, and I noticed her subtle adjustments, shifting slightly closer, leaning in to hear better, her arm brushing my sleeve as she reached for the tea. Each touch was small, accidental in appearance, but intentional in the way it made the space between us feel charged. I became aware of the softness of her movements, the warmth of her presence, and the steady, calm rhythm she maintained, which contrasted with my own restless energy. It was the kind of tension that spoke louder than words, a delicate, unspoken dialogue carried in gestures and glances. Every brush of hands, every fleeting touch, every moment our shoulders or knees met seemed to echo something unarticulated, something growing beneath the surface. I realized that our connection was evolving. It was no longer just emotional or conversational. It was physical, subtle, and layered with restrained awareness. By the time we paused, taking a breath in the quiet living room, the atmosphere had shifted. We were closer in more ways than one emotionally, yes, but physically as well, though never crossing the boundaries of propriety. The moment left me aware of the pull she exerted over me, not with words, but with presence, touch, and the silent acknowledgement that sometimes the smallest gestures speak louder than declarations. After the subtle touches and shared moments in the living room, I excused myself for a moment to step onto the balcony. The city spread below me, lights twinkling in patterns that felt endless, and the evening breeze was cool against my skin. I thought I could clear my head, regain some perspective. I had come to see my girlfriend, yet here I was, consumed by thoughts of her sister. The more I reflected, the more the tension in my chest grew. I had never expected to feel this way, intrigued, drawn, almost magnetically pulled toward someone I shouldn't be thinking about in that way. My mind replayed every small interaction, the brush of her hand, the warmth of her shoulder as she leaned close, the way her laughter had vibrated softly, deliberately. Each memory was vivid, yet completely innocent, and that innocence made it all the more complicated. I heard the faint sound of the balcony door sliding open behind me. She stepped out quietly, not startling me, her presence somehow amplifying the intensity of my thoughts. She stood a few feet away, her hands loosely resting on the railing, the night air tousling a strand of her hair across her face. There was a subtle hesitation in her stance, a pause that seemed to acknowledge the gravity of the unspoken tension. "Beautiful night," she said softly, her voice carrying over the quiet hum of the city. I nodded, unable to tear my gaze from the way the light caught her features, the gentle curve of her jaw, the warmth in her eyes, the slight tilt of her head that made her look both thoughtful and inviting. For a moment, we stood in silence, the air between us charged with a mixture of understanding and restraint. I realized that we were both aware of the invisible line we hadn't crossed, yet neither of us could ignore the pull. Her presence was magnetic, not overtly seductive, but impossible to overlook. It drew me closer emotionally, physically, without a single deliberate step. "I didn't mean to intrude," I said finally, my voice low. But she shook her head gently, a small, knowing smile forming. "You're not intruding," she replied. Her tone was calm, yet it carried an unspoken reassurance, as if she recognized my struggle without needing to name it. The tension was strange, not frustrating, not uncomfortable, but heavy with meaning. I felt the weight of my own hesitation, guilt for the attraction, admiration for her presence, and a deep curiosity about the connection that seemed to be forming. Every instinct told me to pull back, to remind myself of boundaries, yet every fiber of my being wanted to remain exactly where I was, close, aware, and present. We shared a few quiet words about the city below, yet even those mundane observations were charged, layered with unspoken understanding. The way she stood near me, close enough that our shoulders almost touched, made the evening feel suspended, a moment outside of ordinary time, delicate, fleeting, yet unforgettable. By the time she finally retreated back inside, I was left alone on the balcony with my thoughts racing. The pull I felt was undeniable, the curiosity unshakable. I knew that the connection between us had shifted in subtle but profound ways, emotional tension deepened by the smallest touches, glances, and moments of shared silence. I had come to see my girlfriend, but I was leaving with a complicated awareness that the sister's presence had already left an indelible mark on me. Later that evening, the apartment had quieted, the faint hum of the city outside now blending with the soft ambient light inside. We found ourselves in the living room again, sitting on the sofa, neither of us wanting to break the fragile bubble that had formed between us. The earlier moments on the balcony lingered in my mind, pulling my thoughts back to her in a way that was both thrilling and confusing. "I feel like we should be honest," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She leaned slightly toward me, and the subtle warmth radiating from her presence made my pulse quicken. Her gaze held mine steadily, inviting and patient, as if she knew the words I had been struggling to articulate. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I don't know why, but being here with you, it feels different. I can't stop thinking about it." The words sounded clumsy, insufficient to capture the swirl of emotions inside me, Yet she seemed to understand, her expression a mixture of curiosity and quiet recognition. She reached out, placing her hand gently over mine. The touch was soft, deliberate, yet entirely safe, a gesture that conveyed reassurance, connection, and a subtle acknowledgement of the tension we both felt. I could feel the warmth of her skin seeping through the brief contact, and the faint pressure of her fingers grounded me in the moment, making it impossible to ignore the depth of our unspoken feelings. We spoke in low, careful tones, our conversation straying into territory neither of us had explored before. We admitted the pull, the attraction, and the moral complexity of our emotions. It wasn't reckless or impulsive. It was honest, reflective, and deeply human. She shared her own hesitation, the careful consideration of boundaries, the concern for others, yet the undeniable spark that neither of us could dismiss. As she spoke, I noticed the small gestures that made her presence magnetic, the way her eyes softened when she looked at me, the faint tilt of her head when she listened intently, the subtle shift of her shoulder closer to mine as if instinctively seeking proximity. Every detail heightened the intimacy of the moment, creating a space where vulnerability was allowed to flourish without judgment or fear. For the first time, I saw her not just as my girlfriend's sister, but as a person with layers I hadn't expected: her grace, her quiet strength, and the depth of her emotional intelligence. I realized the connection we shared was more than fleeting curiosity. It was a delicate bond forged through trust, vulnerability, and the subtle, magnetic pull of shared presence. We lingered in that quiet space, fingers brushing occasionally, shoulders nearly touching, words flowing in measured honesty. It was a moment suspended in time, charged with emotion yet gentle in its restraint. I felt clarity settle over me. Our connection was real, profound, and undeniable, but it existed within a web of complexities we couldn't ignore. When the conversation came to a close, neither of us moved away immediately. We sat together in the soft glow, absorbing the weight of what had been said, letting our gazes meet in silent understanding. The moment didn't resolve everything it didn't need to. What mattered was that we had recognized the depth of the bond, acknowledged the pull, and accepted the fragility and beauty of the connection that had blossomed between us. By the time I left the living room, I felt a strange combination of clarity and longing. Something significant had shifted, a quiet awareness that would linger, shaping every interaction from that moment forward, a subtle emotional imprint that neither of us could forget. By the time the evening had deepened into night, a quiet stillness had settled over the apartment. The city lights outside twinkled faintly through the windows, casting soft reflections across the polished wooden floors. I sat across from her one last time, aware that this moment, suspended between what had been and what could never fully be, was fleeting. She looked at me, her expression calm yet tinged with a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. "I think we both know there's something here," she said softly, her fingers brushing the edge of the sofa as she spoke. It wasn't a question, it was a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between us over the past hours, subtle, unspoken, yet undeniable. I swallowed hard, searching for words that could capture the mix of longing, respect, and hesitation coursing through me. I feel it too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I also know that this isn't simple. There are lines I can't cross, even if every part of me wants to." She nodded slowly, her eyes glimmering in the low light. The corners of her mouth lifted in a faint, bittersweet smile. "I know. And I wouldn't ask you to. I just wanted you to understand that what's between us, is real. And that it matters." There was a pause, a charged silence filled with the weight of unspoken desires, tender emotions, and the awareness of boundaries that neither of us would break. Yet within that silence, there was also a strange sense of peace. We had acknowledged the attraction, admitted our feelings, and given each other the grace to step back without guilt or resentment. I stood slowly, and she did too. The physical space between us shrank as we approached the doorway, and when I reached the threshold, our hands met. The touch was brief, deliberate, and infinitely meaningful, a lingering warmth that said everything our words could not. I felt the strength of her presence, the depth of her understanding, and the quiet affirmation that this connection, though complicated, would leave a lasting mark on both of us. "I'll remember this," I said softly, my thumb brushing over the back of her hand for the last time. She nodded, her eyes reflecting the same mixture of longing and acceptance that mirrored my own feelings. As I stepped back into the hallway, the weight of the evening settled over me. I realized that I had come seeking comfort in familiarity, but had found something far more profound, an emotional bond that transcended convention, a quiet intimacy that would linger in memory long after the visit ended. Before I turned to leave, we exchanged one final glance, a lingering, charged look filled with acknowledgement, gratitude, and the subtle promise of possibility. It wasn't a declaration of a future together, nor was it an ending without meaning. It was a recognition that, in that brief span of time, two people had connected in a way that neither of us would ever forget. I closed the door behind me, feeling the echo of her presence in the empty apartment. The pull remained, tempered by respect, but it no longer felt like a source of confusion or guilt. It was a quiet, lasting impact, a reminder that some connections, no matter how fleeting or complicated, shape us in ways that endure. As I walked away, the city stretched endlessly before me, and I smiled softly, carrying with me the memory of her warmth, her grace, and the delicate, unspoken bond that had changed everything.